Okay, good morning. Um, so this is um, video discussion on Julia Ellis's um, place essay, which is kind of, in a sense, forms the basis of the class. And I also will talk about the second article, Making of Place, Language in the Making of Place by Tawar. So, and after I complete this, I'll be doing a second video. Um, which you may see first. I don't know how you're going to click on them. But this article will form the basis of what I talk about in the second video. One about doing the annotated bibliography, but more importantly, in terms of this, how to talk about the curriculum project, which is based upon place. And so all the readings on place are there to help you to do that project. And I will, while I've laid it out in the syllabus, I will talk about it and talk through it for you. So let's get started. Let me share the screen. I have notes. I'm not sure how good my notes are, but this is what I have. So, okay, so Julia Ellis is in place, and I'm going to talk around this. So I'll be doing a little free association, making connections, which I think is important. And you'll see some familiar named words in here. So what Ellis's, and let me back up before I start. A number of years ago, I don't even remember the year, I'm pretty sure it was post-Katrina. So it might have been, it's probably in the spring of 2006. I went to a conference, curriculum conference in San Diego. And the motel I stayed at, not that far from the conference, there was a Canadian professor there, and that I'd met previously, and I like the Canadians, and so he introduced me to Julia Ellis, and she and I spent some time. We had breakfast together, and the professor I knew left to get ready, and Julia and I sat there and talked, and she began talking to me about this essay, and I was intrigued. And so she sent it to me. And that's how this really kind of began. So, and I believe at the time, she was teaching at the University of Alberta, or she was a student there. I can't, it's been so long, I don't remember. And I'm really not sure where she is today. Probably should look her up. So that's how I was introduced to this. And as a social studies guy, and as someone who's even though I didn't major in it. You know, I have a deep love for geography. And so this whole idea of place really resonated with me because of my own, I think partly because of my own story. Maybe because as someone who grew up in New Orleans, maybe that was very much on my mind, and how that place was changed by Katrina. And that change is ongoing for the good or the bad. We don't know where that's going to end up. So, you know, Ellis really is trying to, with this article or essay, is really trying to provide the theoretical underpinnings for this understanding of place and how place and space and how it helps create, recreate, conditions students' identities. Now, what I find interesting is this is not that different from what G talks about in what video games have to teach us about learning and literacy. So as Ellis talks about to some degree, of a couple of lines down about social media as space, clearly the video game is a space. It's a virtual place, but it's really a space. And so, and G talks about taking on the identity of the character. Of course, he's really focused on Lara Croft and Tomb Raider and all that good stuff. But I think these points have these two scholars are really talking about that. And if we think about what we do in classrooms, and I know this is an elementary class, but I think particularly in secondary, but same is true in elementary, is we are trying to reshape, recreate our students' identities, okay? And I fall back on the threefold tool of education. As you see a couple lines down, I laid out nature, art, and exercise, right? So the whole point of the threefold tool is to reshape, is to understand what goes into shaping the identities of students, okay? And you as teachers are engaged in art. They come to you with a particular nature, a particular identity, and we are trying to reshape them, and primarily in elementary school. We're trying to reshape them into what one might call a kind of novice, literate person, right? Who is learning how to be literate, how to use reading and writing and numeracy to help them live a better life. We're back to Whitehead, okay, as well here, where knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance is the guilt of vice. The whole point of art. Why else be in school if we're not reconstructing our students' identities? And we have a lot of resistance to this. And this resistance isn't new. This goes back to Plato. And I don't have you read the allegory of the cave, so I probably shouldn't bring it up. But in that allegory, the people that represent students are very resistant to the teacher in that allegory. So much so that in the allegory, in the story, the students cast the teacher out. And so, in much of teaching practice, in terms of the development of method, okay, is about how to reach recalcitrant or reluctant students, okay. And we have lots of students who, from their nature, are very resistant to the kind of change, okay, that art instruction is meant to bring. We also are competing with other things in the world, experience that does change. And here I'm speaking about social media largely, in technology, in, one might argue, different forms of literacies, but without our traditional concept of literacy, then, our students ultimately as adults will be prisoners of the media itself, and they will be too easily manipulated by that media. And we see a lot of that already happening today. So both collective identities, in a sense of kind of, coming out of social psychology and social cultural geography, but also individual identities, is very much bound to place. And the places, if you will, in the spaces in which we live. Okay, be they home, be they school, be they the internet. Okay, so as the next line says, this is the basis of your play story of the curriculum project. And so I've laid out, I got to check on my play story. Now that I think about it, I can't remember if it's a video or I think it's written, but so I'll be doing that. And the play story is meant to form the basis of your curriculum project. Because think of this as an exercise in how to think about using the standards and how to associate content. And I'll explain that here in a second. Okay. So we understand social media as space. I raised the question, we talk about many of these spaces as communities, Facebook as a community. I'm not sure if they're true communities. Okay. Not at least in the way I understand community. I look upon social media spaces as free associations. We associate with people. We come to them for a particular purpose and leave. Okay, for shorter, some a little bit longer times. Now, that said, there's always the potential for community, but that community is built outside of the virtual space. And what do I mean by that? So when, 20 years ago, I guess, when we began having all these shootings, school shootings, Harvard researchers wanted to investigate to see to what degree these school shooters were influenced by games, video games. Okay. And what they discovered was that, in fact, they were not influenced at all. In terms of their motivations, okay, where they're influenced is the type of shooting they do. And I remember seeing on some news show I think it was a Marine officer. I don't think, or it might have been a sergeant. Anyway, he's somebody that trains people how to shoot. Trains Marines how to shoot. And he says what he looked at was that 90% of the shots that these school shooters engaged in were headshots. He goes, we don't train headshots. It's the video game that trains headshots because you get more points for that. But what they discovered is that while they may play video games occasionally, that people generally who play video games talk about and discuss video games with their friends and are part of groups of people, particularly males here, at least at that time, who are engaged in video games and outside of the game, whether it's at school or in a neighborhood, would get together and talk about the game. And I recognized that that was the behavior that my oldest son was engaged in. Not only that, it was very much a literate process because they would read about how to beat the game and how to play the game and do these things. A lot of that has gone by the wayside, and G talks about that, okay? And how the heuristic of playing a game, once learned, you don't need to reteach it. And the game assumes you understand or pick up on that heuristic, that strategy for playing the game. Okay. So virtual spaces are not necessarily communities, although they can lead to the creation of communities, if that makes any sense. At least that's an opinion. Okay. I have no research based upon that other than my understanding of community. And so that raises a further question. Are classrooms true communities? Okay. And I think that's an open question. I think there are situations that over time where the teacher is self-contained and is with those students the full class day, and over a given year, school year, that some community develops within that space. The problem with that thesis, though, is that that usually happens, if it still happens, in smaller school districts, smaller classrooms, in which the students come from a homogeneous by and large come from a homogeneous community. So if we have students from varied communities, um, that this may be a bit more difficult. In my own experience, classroom, particularly my elementary classroom, we were pretty much all students from the same church parish. Communities were slightly different. We were grouped by ability. We were tracked in that sense. I was always pretty much in the middling group. And I think there were probably some aspects of class related to that as well. But we would see each other in our neighborhoods, and we belonged to the same Cub Scout packs, let's say. We played sports at the same playground, even if we didn't live within a few blocks of one another. And as we got older, obviously our neighborhood range expanded once we were able to get on our bicycles and move about any number of streets, although it's still to some degree limited. So that's a good question. And if you're not self-contained, then you only have your students for 50 to 90 minutes, depending on the type of time is set up, blocked or not blocked, etc. And so, I always open that question. Now, I'm coming out of research done by a particular scholar in the 1920s by the name of Edith Stein, one of the first women in Germany to get a philosophy degree. She writes about the psychology of this in terms of community and association. And clearly for her, we have a lot of associations, but our community is something that has to be more intimate than associations. And it's something that has to endure over some time, where associations can be fleeting. Okay. We come together over for associations, we come together for some common purpose, and then we move on. Okay, once that purpose is fulfilled. That's not, community. So, talk about this in terms of just giving you food for thought. Okay. The other thing that Ellis talks about is displacement, and how it impacts identity. We've seen that and experienced that, I think, ourselves because of particularly catastrophe around hurricanes, Katrina, Rita, Gustav, the idea of trauma is part of that. It can be varied types of trauma. And she talks about globalism. Now, when she's writing, it's the impact of, and this is not new. This is tied to colonialism to some degree in the way she's talking about this. Because remember, she's writing this in the early part of the 21st century. It's funny to talk about it that way, but maybe close to 20 years ago. Um, and so how peoples in, let's say, third world countries, developing countries, are being displaced by the extent of Western technology and Western, corporate entities coming in and displacing their communities. I think in the last 10 years, that displacement has shifted um, to where globalism is now displacing communities in the United States. Um, and that seems to be um, ongoing in the news today. Um, and so, and a lot of this is based upon, I said the illusion of mobility. Um, and I think through the 20th century, particularly the first half, um, but well, and it could be just the history of the United States and Canada to some degree. Um, we have this idea of the migrant and even the immigrant in their mobility and moving in um, and moving about the country, looking for work, looking for opportunity. Um, and a lot of that depended upon the idea that we had a frontier. And that's particularly in the 19th century. But even to some degree, that has maintained in the 20. It was maintained in the 20th century. And the movement into, particularly into urban centers, from rural communities for work. Because as we industrialized agriculture, fewer workers were necessary. We also had catastrophes like the Dust Bowl, forced people off their land. That and that to some degree continues. I think we're seeing that probably to some degree in South Louisiana, and I'm not that familiar with it, but we're beginning to see a shift because of the depression in the oil patch in Louisiana, and we'll see to what degree people are able to move. And there's some possibility, but I think we'll see a large people not move and have to struggle and deal and find new ways to work. So this is part of that. Is it that easy for a pipe fitter to go find another job if his pipeline shut down? Okay. So I've talked about how classrooms support positive identities through art and through their ability to apply that art into their everyday lives. This is also should provide students with a level of hope, social hope, if nothing else. And education to a large degree depends upon the social hope. And I think that's an underlying theme we didn't really talk about in Huebner, particularly in the religious metaphors essay. I have schools and bullying here. So, so bullying disrupts identities. And of course, social media opens up a space for bullying that seems to promote it. or at least it's easier to do, less ramifications. And so this is something I think is an ongoing concern for the types of bullying. And this is really more as we move into middle school. Um, and this is about social hierarchy largely. Mean girl syndrome, if you will, is largely about social hierarchy, in how schools ultimately reinforce this. Um, and so, you know, I think we have to, as teachers, be aware of and find, because Ellis is really talking about schools as safe spaces. So she doesn't use that term directly, um, for learning to occur. And I think this too is important, uh, that we are always on the lookout and around bullying. And I think this is also an important thing, obviously, for parents. This is why they need to monitor their children's social media. One of the reasons why you probably should not let your child get on social media at too young of age. Um, okay. Ellis talks about, I'm going to shift a little bit to places evolving. Okay. And I see this evolution of place, and along with that, the evolution of identity, right? As kind of generally tectonic, meaning it's very slow, right? Tectonic plates move at the speed that fingernails grow, okay, is what we're told. So it's difficult to perceive change because we are changing as individuals and as communities, along with the change in place. And it's an interactive change. So as we change, place change, we change place changes, we get changed. It's interplay of ourselves. I have a real sense of this when I do visit New Orleans, having grown up there. And I don't go down that often, particularly anymore. And if I go to the French Quarter or if I go to areas that I grew up in, I can see the kind of change because it might have been 2 to 3 years since the last time I was down there. I'm trying to think about, and it's probably been about that long. I think 10 years ago or just after Katrina, I spent a little bit more time down there than I do now. So it's a little more difficult for me to go down. But as again, we can think about, and I often can relate this to my relationship to my wife, because we've grown together for 41 years, 45 really, and sometimes my pet name for her is my intimate stranger. So, and she probably feels similar to me, but I pay attention to this more theoretically, who I am. And, I can suddenly wake up in one day and boom, recognize that this change has taken place in her over this time. And I didn't perceive it until a certain point. Let's call it a step function, where there's a shift, sudden shift. But there's been, take like an earthquake, right? Step function. But there's constant pressure and little bits of movement until that occurs. And I think this is true within communities. And so, um, so I think this is a very interesting way to think about how place and space moves us and changes us. And I'm not, recognize I'm not using the word progress, because I don't think it's progress necessarily. As an old man at 68, I look back upon my world in my youth and understand particular types of stability in institutions. And I don't know that we're in a better place or space today. So teachers' role, so this comes back to space and place. And I draw upon John Dewey in his seminal work, Democracy in Education. But his School as Social Function is the chapter. And he recognizes that the teacher's primary role is to construct classroom environments. And that's what curriculum is. Through curriculum, you're constructing classroom environments. So as you create develop a curriculum unit, right, you have to think about your classroom environment, both physically and socially. But that's your primary responsibility, okay, is to create learning, if you want learning and teaching environments. So we are the, manipulators of space as teachers. And this kind of goes back to Aoki's situational practice, right? Where he talks about this to some degree, okay? Particularly from a knowledge base, which the knowledge base is, if you will, space. Place, local place is important. And because a student's understanding of their own place is their first knowledge. And if you go back and remember the Harvey essay that I wrote, I mention that Aristotle believed that all knowledge moved from the known to the unknown. And I think this is particularly important at the elementary level. So as we get to know our students and get to know about what they know about their immediate world, if you will, now, and we listen to the way they talk about things, then we can begin using their words, using their knowledge in our teaching to move them to the knowledge we want them to learn, to the new knowledge. Okay. And this is important to understand how language is used in our everyday lives, what some might call ordinary language use. Because the language that we often try to use in the classroom isn't necessarily ordinary. It's a kind of holiday language for the classroom. But, third and fourth graders don't live in a holiday world. They're still living, even though they've been in school for a bit of time, they're still living in their everyday world. And so if we listen to how they speak, if we listen to the words they use, what somebody has called a language game, right? Then we can imagine the culture, if you will, the subculture, the form of life better, the way they engage in space and place. And this is, I think, is important. So that's kind of my ideas on Ellis, on Tuan. I don't have a lot to say. I will say this, Tuan, and I thought it was a very good article. And obviously Ellis is using Tuan's work here in her, that's why I wanted you to look at it. Tuan's thesis raises questions, I think, about what is a natural environment. So I spent a lot of time in national parks. And of course, national parks really work at providing wilderness areas. So wilderness then becomes those areas least touched by human beings. But the idea that we call them wilderness areas, are they truly still wilderness areas? Okay, because we name them in particular ways. And she's talking about language and nature. And it just made me wonder, do we have any truly untouched, meaning untouched by human hands, which I also think is problematic since we're as much part of nature as any other animal, right? That raises a whole different set of questions and how we want to minimize human involvement. Okay, so is the natural world has for the last 10,000 years longer, human beings have been part of that. Hominids have been part of that, 100,000 years? I'm probably underestimating the time frames. So, and I'm thinking of the United States. So, in terms of 10,000 years, obviously it's older in the old world, as we used to call Europe and Asia, so Africa, particularly. So, it raises questions about how we use language around the natural world and place. Okay, because we name places, and I go, and I would suggest that to name is to be human, right? This is what we do. This is the point of the Genesis passage, where Adam, before Eve arrives. So this is Genesis 2, if you will. That Adam goes about and names animals and plants, and he gets to know them, but he's still unfulfilled, right? He still doesn't have a companion. There's some that would suggest he never really met a dog yet. But then God creates Eve for him, and they become one, which I think is a beautiful passage. Okay. So, I've actually, read about a lesson in which the teacher allowed students to look at a blank map with no names on it, with just features, and to begin naming features. Okay. And then she would use, and this goes back to my earlier statement, then she began using those names to teach the given names of those features, the official names of those features. And apparently it worked very well. So that's one example. So I have to use students' names for things when you teach. here listening becomes a key component of our teaching, okay? So the other example is I went to observe an intern teach a biology class, and it ended up being, they were dissecting frogs, okay? And groups of students of 2 and 3 would dissect these frogs. And the teacher did a wonderful technical job at moving about the room, making sure everybody was on task, making sure they were filling out the papers right, making sure they got the right names, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I sat back while I watched her and listened to the students. She didn't listen to the students. And it was wonderful to listen to these different groups of students describe what they were seeing in the frog. In the way they talked about the colors, the way they of the frog, of the internal organs, the way they talked about their shapes, the ookies and odds and different levels of disgust from some of the females. So it was all very colorful. And you could come away with that and be able to use the way they describe things, if you had been listening, to then teach them the proper names of all those internal organs. So that was another great experience. And so this is something I learned from doing student-teacher observations. And this was fairly early on. This probably was in my second or third or fourth semester, probably my second year at Nichols, maybe my third. So being able to use names within space to describe things and place and things, very important. Of course, names have the power to both create and to destroy. And when I think about destruction, normally destruction is a product of the misapplication of the good. That often when we destroy communities or we destroy place, it's also interesting that we actually can create place, and we do, geographically, socially. That we're trying to apply a good to a certain extent that doesn't work properly. It's really not a good. Okay. I won't call it an evil, but it's really not a good. Okay. So it's some thoughts on Tuan's article. So that's the end. That's all I have to say. I hope this helps you think about your discussion in terms of the gloss. I'm sorry. No, discussion. I don't remember what class is this. I think it's discussion on these place articles. Sorry, didn't mean to throw gloss out. It's not, doesn't apply. And if I raise any questions you want to ask, please do so. But as I said, you'll be getting a second video here shortly today. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to looking at your place stories in these discussions.